go. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Morning.
All right. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time, which because of sales meeting was a few weeks ago. But we're going to get started on the in-depth review of the GAR contracts. We're going over the purchase and sale agreement, part 2. We're going to pick up where we left off and kind of keep going. As a reminder, little disclaimer at the bottom of the slide, we are not lawyers. These are opinions and interpretations of a broker. You should consult your own broker if it's not me, and attorney, if you have any questions about it. All right, moving on. Enough of that. All right, jumping right into earnest money. So earnest money seems pretty straightforward, right? You put how much earnest money? Now, this is always the million-dollar question. How much earnest money should you put? Right? And that's the question the buyer wants to ask you. And as a seller, how much earnest money should you expect? And that's the question that your seller's going to ask you. So let's hear some answers. What do you think? Josh, when you're out representing a client, how much earnest money, let's stay focused on earnest money, do you think you should put?
I mean, generally, I expect or would want to see 2% if there's a loan involved, and 5 to 10% if they're, if they're a cash buyer. But if there's, I don't get super hung up on it, and the fact that it's so arbitrary if there's no option money. So, and there's a due diligence period. So generally, if someone offers $7,000 earnest money on a $500,000 sale, or I should say $1 million sale, I don't expect it to get up to 20,000. If they want to increase it, that's fine. But it's, I haven't seen a whole lot of earnest money lost when there's, and 6 to 10 day due diligence.
Well, I've seen a lot in my career. I've seen a lot of earnest money lost. But I've also seen a lot of agents not paying attention to their contracts, so that those two things go together.
Yeah, they're not filling out the reminder of important dates form and sending it to all parties.
Probably one of the steps they're missing, and we will definitely go over that form as we keep going. So let's talk about the 3 blanks here, right? We've got 3 options. Earnest money is paid. One of the things that is good about this is it no longer says what kind of earnest money you're going to pay. Like, it's just US dollars, and it doesn't really matter if it comes ACH or check or money order or gold doubloon, like whatever the person holding it will accept is reasonable. I once saw a contract that put a classic truck down as earnest money. Like, they literally wrote a special stip that said in lieu of cash, the classic truck that they moved to the seller's driveway was the earnest money. It's a little quirky. I didn't like that. But people do weird stuff. So you can either do it as of the offer date. Now, if you fill that out, this is an important one. If you fill that out and say as of the offer date, and you're doing all this electronically, and your client is not with you at the time of the signing of the offer, when you send this offer to the listing agent and you don't have money in hand, or the holder doesn't have money in hand, are you okay?
No,
not at all, right? That's real bad. So to Josh's point, if there's due diligence, most listing agents are going to be reasonable, and help me out, listing agents. If you have a 10-day due diligence, do you expect the earnest money in the first 2 days of contract? Or are you okay with getting it towards the end of the due diligence or at the end of the due diligence, knowing that if they cancel during the due diligence, they get it back anyway, right? Which has always been my argument. Like, why put $10,000 down on day 1 of a 12-day due diligence, only to find out 10 days later that you need to get it back? And oh, by the way, now we've deposited it. It's going to take 10 more days for it to clear and get back to you. And, it's annoying for everybody. So I personally, my favorite is the blank days from binding agreement, and that blank is typically towards the end of due diligence, right? Like either right in line with the end or towards the end, not after, but towards the end. So, that's my opinion. Let's talk about what the paragraphs say, because this is the part that we
Hey,
do.
can we talk? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can we talk about that a little bit more? Because I have a completely different opinion on a few things you said.
All right, well, share. That's what we're doing here.
Yeah. Like on earnest money, I mean, Zach's been doing this for a long time,
For
and
sure.
he's not always right, but he's seldom wrong.
A good way to put it.
And like what Josh said, 2% earnest money is what we like to see on finance deals.
Mm-hmm.
And on cash deals, we like to see like 5 to 10% earnest money.
Yep,
It's with low earnest money on a cash deal, it's easy for those buyers to walk away.
for sure.
And like I'm in a situation right now where I got a $700,000 and 20 grand from the builder, and the builder's having an issue getting a tree removal permit. And so, the seller's like, no, I'm not giving you an extension. Like your contingencies are over, your earnest money's on the line, like you got to close by the agreed date.
Yep,
And looking back, I wish I would have asked for more than 20 grand in earnest money from this builder, because I think a builder can walk away from 20 grand, where if I had 5 to 10% earnest money, it would be a lot more painful for that builder to walk away.
absolutely.
You
And
know,
I think that's one of the things that we talked about last time a lot, of the every contract is different, right? Like when we talk about what should you put in the blanks, it's a general rule of thumb as a guide, but it's not the law. It's not, what you should always do, because every contract situation is different. Yes, an institutional builder that's, throwing money down, I for sure would push to get more earnest money from them, because I know that they are more likely to be able to walk away from it than a homeowner, right? An owner occupant's probably not walking away from 20 grand on a $700,000 house, just generally. But yes, an investor type person that's, running and gunning all the time, and that's a drop in the bucket, they'll make it up on the next one, they're probably more likely to. And I think that's important to look at each situation differently, because the other aspect is, let's go the other direction. If I end up, and haven't gotten to contingencies yet, but if I end up with a contract that's got a VA buyer on it, would I expect to get a lot of earnest money? Probably not, because they're probably not putting any money down because of their veteran benefits, which is great that they earned those and they have those. And we have to be able to explain to sellers why that's different than, your institutional buyer that we actually want to get, 10% earnest money from, to try and keep them from just running away for no reason. So, I think that's a very good point in distinguishing between who you're working with and who's coming in on the contract. You have to look at that. You have to look at what their risk is, and that's the balance of risk always. And earnest money is a big piece of that, is what's the balance of risk. Because the other aspect might be, there's a big difference between a seller who has lived in a house for 40 years, has zero house mortgage payment, it costs them pennies to keep going month to month, versus somebody that's got a 100% loan and is paying $10,000-$15,000 a month. They probably want different amounts of earnest money, right? Because if you're going to be off the market for 30 plus days, you're going to incur another mortgage payment. And so now that factors into what's the risk reward balance for the seller. And so that's a great point. It's absolutely should be a conversation. My only comment is that you're doing a lot of paperwork if you do earnest money early in due diligence. just because you're if they're going to walk away, they would have gotten it back anyway. So I don't stress too much about it being further into due diligence, but definitely before due diligence is over, right? Like we want to lock them in before due diligence is over, which kind of presses the point. It's interesting if you look at kind of buyer's mentality. If I've got a 10-day due diligence and my earnest money is due on the 7th day, their due diligence in their mind is almost up on the 7th day, right? Because I'm having to submit that money, and having to write that check is a different conversation. Now, some of the old school agents might say, well, that's another opportunity for them to change their mind, right? Like it's another opportunity for them to get freaked out, have buyer's remorse, all those sorts of things. And that's very possible. But I would just be very cautious of using the as of offer date given our electronic environment, where especially if you're having a third party hold it, which is a whole nother conversation we'll get to in a second, that you gotta have some understanding of where their risk is, what their tolerance for risk is, and then you have to have some understanding of, can the money be deposited as of offer date? Because if you can't have a check in hand, that's not a valid contract. But it got me?
Yeah, and I wanted to comment on the days within binding agreement date.
Yeah.
Because and I heard you say more in line with like the end of the due diligence, and I think I could agree with that if I was representing the buyer.
Sure.
But I also personally wouldn't do it that way if I was representing the buyer, nor would I do it that way representing the seller. Like I want that earnest money deposited as soon as possible. Like I want to know it's
Because you're trying to
check's
lock them
good,
down, right? Like
it
you want to make sure
clears.
it's solid.
Yeah, like mentally, both the
Mhm.
buyer and the seller have put their skin in the game,
I agree with you.
and so I think that's got to
And
be
what
within
about
like
I'm
3 days
representing a buyer in a multiple offer situation. Am I going to drag earnest money out to the last day of due diligence, or am I going to put it in right at the beginning?
immediately. Yeah.
Right? Like it makes it feel stronger to have the cash in hand, right?
Mhm.
So those I probably would actually try to coordinate with the buyer to make sure I had check in hand so that we could submit the offer with the earnest money as of offer date, because that's the strongest play in that environment. Again, there's not one right answer, right? It depends on the situation, it depends on the players, it depends on the competition, it depends on so many different things on how you have to kind of figure out. And I think that's good discussion on kind of the pros and cons and what you might run into in those situations of how strong you might be. So that's good. Good job.
Brett, a question.
Yeah.
It's Dan. If you get a situation like Ken was mentioning, where the goal is really to go forward, but you want to apply some pain to the party that's, not performing on the dates, can't
Sure.
you make an amendment that you want to either up the earnest money, or in consideration for extending the due diligence a little bit, that you want option money?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
I have seen numerous times with due diligence, and we talked about due diligence period last time, I think, didn't we? Yes.
Yes.
No, we didn't.
Oh.
Nope, it's next. Due diligence. I've seen numerous times where extensions of due diligence were granted by a seller in exchange for money. And typically option money, because they don't want to risk it, right? Like if I give you a 4-day extension on due diligence and I get more earnest money and then you cancel 2 days later, well, you just get it back, right? Like, so that's not necessarily beneficial. So when you look at option money, that's one of the things that we think comes in pretty handy. All right, let's quickly jump through some of this. We're good combo, but we will not get through the rest of, and I originally thought we'd do this in 2 parts. I've already put in a third part because I know for sure if we're lucky, we get through the first page today. And then there's a whole nother section of all kinds of other language in the contract that we need to go over and we need to talk about. So we're at least to 3 sessions, just keeping everybody on target. All right. So entitlement to earnest money. So what this says, right, is that if you fail to enter into a binding agreement, so if nobody signs it, so there's that if I have earnest money in hand from a buyer, the seller never signs the contract, well, I just give it back to him, right? Failure of any unexpired contingency or condition which the agreement is subject. So any of due diligence, those sorts of things. Termination of the agreement due to the default of the seller. So quite easily, the seller defaults on the contract and the buyer is entitled to earnest money, or termination of the agreement in accordance with a specific right to terminate set forth in the agreement. Otherwise, the earnest money shall be applied towards the purchase price, property at closing, and other used to purchase, then the earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. So in other words, if they show up with, a suitcase full of cash, which is a bad idea, they can get that money back. All right, disbursement of earnest money. This is a paragraph that's super important. And I think you should take a minute to explain it to your clients. Because what this says is the holder shall disperse the money upon. And I had an argument the other day with a qualifying broker of one of our major brokerages that they couldn't move earnest money from the trust account unless it closed or terminated. And I said, well, that's not actually true. And this paragraph is the part that says that's not actually true. Because the first reason that I can disperse earnest money is, of course, the closing of the property. The second reason is a subsequent written agreement of the buyer and the seller. So if the buyer and seller agree to do something with the earnest money and we have it in an agreement, an amendment, we'll do something, we'll release it. Okay, in this case, it was converting it into option money. So I needed to release it from the trust account to the seller. So that can be done if I have a written agreement. Obviously, in order of a court arbitrator having jurisdiction involved, and the failure of the parties to enter into a binding agreement where there's no dispute over the formation of enforceability. In addition, the holder may disperse the earnest money upon reasonable interpretation of the agreement, provided that, this is the piece that people get caught up on, you have to give everybody 10 days notice stating who, and if I'm the broker holding the earnest money, I have to give all parties 10 days notice and state whom and why the disbursement is being made. To whom. And there's no interpretation shall be made by the holder dividing the earnest between the buyer and the seller. So I can't say, oh, well, both people kind of screwed up, so I'm going to give half the money to the buyer and half the money to the seller. It's not an option. If the buyer and the seller agree to that, they can do a mutual termination and write that in, and absolutely, buyer can get half the money and seller can get half the money. In some cases, I've seen agents get part of the earnest money. If everybody agrees, if the buyers and the sellers agree to it in writing, but the holder can't make that determination. It all has to go to one party or the other. Everybody with me? That's an important piece that I think people forget. Blah, blah, blah.
Hey, Brett.
Yeah.
Is that a positive or a negative reason why the lawyer or the broker should or should not be holding that earnest money in your opinion?
Let's talk about in a second the holder of earnest money. We talked about it a little bit last time. But to me, the holder of the earnest money, it's very important that you trust the person holding the earnest money. Because the holder of the earnest money does have, and this paragraph is part of that power, they have the ability to kind of go forth. And so even after sending my 10-day letter, if somebody comes back and says, no, that's completely wrong, that's not what the contract says, I can say, oh, well, no, I think I do agree with that. Here's 10 more days. By the way, I'm going to do that again. And then I can disperse the money. The problem is that there's, there's issues with dealing with that and, trying to figure that out. So from that standpoint, you just have to figure that out. What I would say is that, attorneys are much less likely to have conversation. They're going to look at the contract and they're going to go with what the contract says, and they're probably going to press the parties to have agreement, because it's always better for the holder to have written agreement on who gets the earnest money. So whether it's a release at the end of at the bottom of a unilateral termination or a mutual termination, something signed by all parties that says this is where the money goes makes all of us happy when we're holding earnest money. Having to do interpretations is not a good thing. You want somebody that's willing to have that conversation. And like we talked about last time, you have to be paying attention to, if you put the attorney, or if the other party puts the attorney is going to hold earnest money, I would have a conversation with them and say, what is your policy on how do you handle disputes? What do you deal with? Because some attorneys, especially years ago, would basically just say, well, we just send it to interpleader and you have to go to court to figure it out. We don't make interpretations. So, there are forms that help protect against that now, but at the end of the day, that next paragraph down, C, is interpleader. If the dispute can't be resolved after a reasonable time, holder can say, it's got to go to interpleader. You guys got to pay to have somebody figure this out. And that costs people money. And usually earnest money is not enough. Sometimes it is, but usually it's not enough to deal with that. You end up burning it on attorney fees and things. So that's the piece that you kind of have to pay attention to. Of course, there's a hold harmless. When I'm working with an investor one time, and they were like, you realize everything in this contract is to protect you as an agent. Yes, because these were written by the Georgia Association of Realtors. And so there are lots and lots of protection paragraphs in here about holding us harmless and the holder harmless, because otherwise the risk of doing transactions would just be too great and it wouldn't be worth it, right? And that's why, to be honest, a lot of brokerages, especially smaller brokerages, won't hold earnest money because they don't want to deal with the risk and liability of holding earnest money and having to get in the situation where they deal with it, is disbursement. All right, let's keep moving. We are on page 1 and we're almost a half an hour in. So let's keep going. This is a big one too. Inspection and due diligence. Due diligence period. My favorite is, well, how many days should I put in? I don't know. How many days does a client want? How many days does a client need? How many days will the seller give you? Right? Like, those are all questions that you have to ask during the transaction, because if I can get 14 days of due diligence as a buyer, why wouldn't I take it? Right? Because that gives me lots of time to figure it out. But at the same time, as a seller, I probably don't want to give them 14 days of due diligence, because now it's 2 weeks of just hanging out, waiting for them to change their mind because the sky's a different color and I'm out everything. I've got nothing to show for it. And I've been off the market for 2 weeks. So this is, again, another example of that balance of risk and reward. The addition of the option payment for due diligence, to me, is huge in dealing with that balance of risk and reward. What value is it to you as a buyer to get an extra? Let's say that the seller is willing to give you 3 days, but I really need 6. Okay, so if I give the seller $1,500 for an extra 3 days, is that enough for the seller? Maybe. You might be surprised how little option money. People always think, when this first came out and during the craziness of real estate the last few years, we've seen numbers in here of $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. We've seen massive numbers in these. But as the market normalizes, we see a lot less of the $100,000 option money and a lot more of the $500 option money or $1,500 option money. Because think about it, as a seller, balance of risk and reward, if I am taking this contract and I know for sure I'm getting $1,500, it's not earnest money. There's earnest money as well, but I know even if they walk away during due diligence, I got my $1,500. Does that make me feel more comfortable about the contract? Does that make me feel like, one, they're more serious, and two, it reduces my risk, right? Because I just got paid $1,500 for 7 days or 10 days or whatever it is, right? That's the piece that you have to really look at in this as far as how that balances. One of the things I don't understand, and hopefully they'll fix in the next iteration or maybe mid-year, is they took out the check and ACH and wire transfer for earnest money, but they didn't for option money. I don't know why. So just, you know, something to pay attention to. Any questions about this piece, the top, the actual first page step, blanks, thoughts, processes? Inspection due diligence. This is, of course, the buyer's right to inspect the property. It's where it talks about that they have access to the property. They're able to look. It's the bold section that says if the buyer is concerned the property might be used as a lab for production of methamphetamine or a dump site for the same, that you should review this register. There are, of course, inspectors that can do inspections for all kinds of different things. The buyer's right to inspect the neighborhood. I think it's so important to explain to buyers that they need to inspect not just the house that they're buying or the condo or the townhouse. They need to inspect the property and the area and the neighborhood and the community, because you're going to be part of that. And so sometimes when you're out looking for houses, you're drifting all over town and they get kind of turned around as to where they are, and they don't realize that, oh, well, this has whatever, and that has whatever. Again, not something that we're pointing them to, but this is their time to decide whether there's too many crazy people on the street, right? Or there's too many, like whatever. The kids drag race on the street next to it, or there's traffic noise or whatever, right? Like whatever their issues might be. If there's a big development, if there's, talks about crime and sex offenders, like all of those things. And it lists a whole bunch of things on here, from landfills, quarries, power lines, airports, cemeteries, prisons, stadiums, odor and noise, yada, yada, yada. All things they need to think about. And so I think it's important for everyone to kind of take a minute and push that too. Any questions about inspections and due diligence? I think we're very comfortable. It's been around long enough and been trucking along. More inspection. This is the right to inspection right continue through closing. This is a big one. Sometimes I had one the other day that said the listing agent told our agent that they weren't allowed to come in the property again. Yes, I am. And it doesn't even say in there, anybody read in there that I have to give them 24 hours notice or anything like that? No. I have the right to inspect the property, right? So at reasonable times is the only thing that it says. So I can't inspect the property at, 1 a.m. probably. That's not really reasonable. But I can tell you this morning that I need to be there this afternoon pretty easily. Again, a little bit of courtesy goes a long way in a transaction, but at the same time, Don't let somebody bully you off of the fact that you have the right to go into the property. And that's important. In buyer's inspection indemnification obligations, again, lots of protection. Buyer holds harmless everybody. If I slip and fall, I can't sue, all that kind of stuff. Lead-based paint, hazard evaluation, anything built prior to 1978, they have the right. And of course, it spells out that the lead-based paint exhibit is there, and all the things on how that works. Have the right to do the 10-day, they can do that. So even if you don't have due diligence, if the house is built prior to 1978 and you do a lead-based paint test and it comes back positive, you have the right to terminate and get your money back. Did you get that? A lot of people miss that. Due diligence period, sold subject to due diligence, be an option contract during that. This is the clarification of how we know how a due diligence period works. So I think it's important to read through that, understand that. At the end of due diligence, this is the piece that so many people these days don't as much mess up. But years ago, when we transitioned to right to inspect to due diligence, people would mess up all the time. You have to have the due diligence worked out. Everything that you want agreed to has to be done by the end of due diligence. When due diligence ends, the buyer is accepting the property in as-is condition, subject to any amendments to the agreement to address concerns agreed to by the parties. So they're buying it as is at that point, which again, these are things. People do cash things because, well, by definition, the contract is cash, so you don't really need to do a cash thing. People do as is condition. By definition, the contract is as is condition. I'm buying the property as is where is, unless we agree to something else. And that's partly what this says. Seller's duty to disclose. This is a very short but very important. This does not mean that they have to have a disclosure statement, a GAR disclosure statement, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. What it does mean is that if they know that there's a latent or hidden defect, they need to tell the buyer if they don't believe the buyer can reasonably discover it during a careful inspection. That's a very strong statement. If, trying to think of some examples that I've had. Recently, I got a call that somebody found that the septic system for this house did not have a drain field behind it. It was just everything fed into the tank and that was it. I don't know how that works because that doesn't, it needs a leach field to go somewhere, right? Like it's got to go somewhere. But this house did not have a leach field. That is a defect that could not be easily found because I'm not even certain with an inspection of the tank that they would notice that there was no leach field, right? Like that, I don't know for sure that that would be found that way. So I think that would be considered a hidden defect if the seller knew. Seller has to know that it's there. They can only tell you what they know about, right? On the opposite of that, if somebody has ripped all the wiring out of a house, that doesn't happen as much anymore, but for a while there, that was a very common thing. You would walk into a house and the drywall there'd just be tears all the way through because somebody had come through and cut and pulled all the copper wiring out of the house. And that would not be a hidden defect, right? Because when you as a buyer walk into the house, you have these big holes in the wall and it's pretty obvious that there's no wiring there. And so that's considered something that you wouldn't necessarily have to disclose because it's very obvious. So just think about it this. Here's my rule for disclosure, which while we're on this, and we'll say it again when we get to disclosure statements, is if you think you might need to disclose it, you should, right? I've never seen anybody sued for over disclosing. I've seen lots of people sued for under disclosing, but I've never seen anybody sued because they disclose too much information that they know. So disclose it. Warranties transfer. This is the seller agrees to transfer buyer at closing subject to the buyer's acceptance thereof. And at the buyer's expense, if there is any cost associated with that transfer, important piece, seller's interest in any manufacturing warranty, service contracts, terminate, treatment, all that kind of stuff. So again, if I have an active termite bond and I can transfer that over to the buyer and it costs $200 to do that, I can give the buyer that option and they have to pay the $200. I don't need a special stipulation that says that. It's right here in the contract. All the time I see people write special stipulations that are just repeating what's already in the contract. So pay attention to what's in the contract so you don't have to write special stipulations if you don't. Repairs. All agreed upon repairs and replacements shall be performed in a good and workmanlike manner prior to closing unless otherwise agreed to in writing by the buyer and seller. So when you do your amendment to address concerns and you say they need to repair this and repair this and repair this, do you have to say prior to closing? You don't have to. Now, if you want it to be 3 days prior to closing or 4 days prior to closing or whatever, then you'd need to say that. But this paragraph covers the fact that it is, those repairs have to be done prior to closing. Okay? So don't let people argue about the fact, oh, I'll take that care of that later. Remember, very little survives the contract closing. All right, moving on to the next. Let's lead-based paint it.
Hey, Brett, can I ask a question?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Okay, so on the buyer's inspection rights, like access to the property.
Yep.
All right, I'll try to make this brief, but I've got a couple of individuals who want to buy investment property, like a duplex or a triplex.
Sure.
This has come up in the last year or so. You can't have access to the property until you're in a binding agreement. I've seen this.
Property, that is very common. And commercial property, that's very common.
Right. Okay. But I'm just saying that somebody owns a duplex or a triplex and they don't want you to go in there until you make a binding agreement. So you can't make an assessment of the condition or anything except from the photos and the disclosures.
Sure.
So somebody had, if they're making it difficult up front to see it because they're saying, well, you know, there's tenants and you got to, isn't this going to be a hassle? I mean, is there anything that you can recommend where, you know, we have the right to, you know, continue to inspect or set up a home inspection or property inspection at the time that, you know, it needs to be scheduled? But is there something you can do to make these people understand that, you know, if you're in a binding agreement, we're coming in?
So, well, in a binding agreement, like that's what this paragraph C says, right? That I have the right to inspect.
No, I see it as a practical matter, but I'm saying if they're making it difficult to even see it, is there something else that you should have on there besides relying on this paragraph?
I mean, I think this paragraph is strong enough personally. Okay.
Just asking.
What I would say is that if they wanted something different than the standard protection, like if they want 24 hours notice or they want whatever, they need to have that in here as a special stipulation as the listing agent, as the seller.
Yeah. Right.
And I've seen that before, right? Especially in an investment type property like that, where you've got multiple tenants and as an investor going into investment property, you don't want to run off the tenants probably. So you don't want to piss them off. So you kind of, again, a little courtesy goes a long way, but it has to go both ways. So if you're not getting courtesy the other direction, then you have to strong arm a little bit. Like I said, we had a listing agent the other day that said that the buyers couldn't go through and do a final walkthrough. But they had already looked at the house.
Right.
And we're like, no, actually, and we sent them this paragraph. And they had to have a conversation with their broker, and they finally came back and were like, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, no, we know, but now it's just annoying.
Well, the last comment
there's no solution for dealing with agents that don't know what they're doing. I can't fix that.
Right. Well, just for general comment, I had buyers interested in a property and you couldn't see it till you were under a binding agreement. And then I was told by the listing agent, remarkably, the tenants weren't aware that the property was for sale. So you couldn't go on the property or anything else. And there was never an opportunity to see it. So the listing expired because nobody ever got to see it, to my knowledge.
Yep. No, that is actually very typical. Investors often don't tell the tenants that they're selling the property because they don't want them to freak out, especially if it's towards the end of their lease. They don't want them to freak out and leave because that kills the value of the property.
No,
So,
like I said,
yeah.
I get it. It's just weird because
No, it
from the
does
buyer-
make it harder, right?
Yeah,
It makes
and
life
from the
harder.
buyer side, it's like, well, we're buying this without even seeing it, and I'm saying,
Yeah.
no, you're getting into a contract with an option,
Yeah, and
of due
that's the key
diligence.
in those contracts. And this going back to that balance of risk. If I haven't seen the property yet, my due diligence is going to be longer, right? Because I need time to first see it, then evaluate what I want to go in and look at, then have that to go look at, and then see what the results are. Whereas if I've already seen it, like when I bought my house, I had already seen it, and because of my background, I still had it inspected, but I did a very short due diligence because I knew that I had already seen 90% of what was wrong with it because of my experience and my background.
Exactly.
And so, that allows for a very different situation. Any other comments on due diligence and inspection? Because those are the same thing now. Nope. All right. All right, lead-based paint, pretty straightforward. Please don't check this box if it wasn't built prior to 1978, that it was. Check the box that it wasn't. I've seen so many people just leave it blank, which again, we talked about blanks in a contract are a really bad thing. It's just not something we should do because it makes the contract potentially voidable. If any portion, this is the important statement, if any portion, so if you're getting pushback from a seller that says, well, I completely redid the house in 2000. Great. When was the house originally built? 1965. Okay, so we need to do lead-based paint. But I completely redid the house. So you're telling me that no portion of the house was built prior? Did you scrape it to the ground? There was just dirt, and then you built a new house in 2000? No, you renovated. Okay, then we need to do a lead-based paint exhibit. So if any portion of the residential dwelling on the property was built prior to 1978, you have to attach the lead-based paint exhibit to the agreement. Residential dwelling includes any painted fixtures or material used therein that was built or manufactured prior to 1978. This is the one that gets some of us in these semi-historical districts. You get a house that was built brand new, ground up, and they want to really live to the true whatever style, pick one, and they start putting in all these fireplaces and built-in bookshelves and curios and railings and doors from that they've salvaged from a 1940s home. Do they need a lead-based paint exhibit?
Yes.
Absolutely, they do. Now, in a general house that you don't think, again, it comes to the seller's knowledge. If the seller doesn't know that those things were salvaged and they're all old, usually it's relatively obvious, but sometimes people don't know things, then you're probably not going to. But if you as a professional go in and say, that door looks really old. I've never seen a door built that way since 1978, right? And the seller says, yeah, I don't know. I heard a story that it might be. Do a disclosure. Do an exhibit, just in case, right? If the house is built in 1999 and it's a row house that has all new crappy material in it, because the 90s were not great for construction.
Really?
No. Do you need a lead-based paint disclosure? An exhibit? No. Should you have one? You know, there are companies in the city that require lead-based paint disclosures on every single property they list. I personally think that's a really bad idea, because you're opening yourself up to EPA audits that it's just a bad idea. We'll talk about the exhibit when we get to it. Let's talk about quickly brokerage relationships. We got 10 minutes left. I don't think we're going to make it to the end of the slides. Brokerage relationships in the transaction. This needs to be filled out. You can't just leave one side blank. If there's not somebody on the other side, what's happening? You need to establish whether you're treating them as a customer or doing dual agency, or there's a designated agent. You gotta lay that out. If they aren't willing to sign a customer acknowledgement and they're not you're not acting as a dual agent, so you're the listing agent, a buyer comes to you and says, I'm an attorney. This is typical. I'm an attorney. I'm going to represent myself. What do you put on the other side when they won't let you act as a customer? They won't sign an authorization to be a client, a customer. Sorry. What do you think? Not all at once. Come on. What do you put?
Well, they're not a client unless you have a written agreement.
They're not a customer unless you have a written agreement either.
Right. So there's no, I mean,
there's literally no representation, agency, customer. There's no relationship there at all, right?
right.
I personally would write buyer's broker is NA or none. And then the special steps, I would explain that buyer refused to work with listing broker as a customer and is completely representing and handling all of their own side of the transaction. Why would I do that? Because I want to cover myself. I'm going to push hard to get them to sign a customer agreement, because why wouldn't they sign a customer agreement? You know what a customer agreement says? It says, hey, I don't represent you as a client. I can't advise you on anything, but I'll fill out paperwork for you at your direction. That's what they're going to want anyway. So most attorneys will acquiesce and do that, but every now and then you get one that won't. So just something to think about. All right, now we do have several pages, I think, of language that goes with this. I think it's important that you've read this and that you make sure that you explain this to your clients. No agency relationship. Buyer and seller acknowledge that they are not represented by a broker. If they are not represented by a broker in a client relationship, they are each solely responsible for protecting their own interest, and the broker's role is limited to performing ministerial acts for that party. And if the same brokerage firm is representing one party as a client or the other party as a customer, to the broker and all the brokers affiliated licensees are representing the client. Just spells it out. I'm a big fan of ABCs of agency. It helps explain all this stuff early on in the process. Dual agency disclosure. I'm not a fan of dual agency. Dual agency is legal, but the only person I've ever seen win in a dual agent situation is the agent. It's just how it works. If there's instead of two parties in a transaction, there's now three, and only one of those three wins. So my opinion, I wouldn't do dual agency. I've never done dual agency. Designated agency, on the other hand, is different. I take Ken and pit him against Josh in a buyer versus seller situation, even though you both work for the same brokerage. And you might, but you're going to represent each party as strongly as you need to. And clearly Josh is more animated about it than Ken. So that's basically having your own agents, just knowing that they're within the same brokerage, right? That's the only thing that is. Dual agency is one person taking all the money. It's just, sorry, my opinion. I think, yep, there's more on these. There's lots of the.
Quick question, Brett.
Yeah.
Okay, if you go back to that designated agency, I know
Yep.
this is weird, but if you have a listing and somebody steps forward as a buyer and says, well, you know, I don't want to sign whatever, and you recommend designated agency, this is even odd to ask. Can you ask the other agent in the office for some sort of referral, or is that some conflict?
I mean, you know, if you give somebody a client, I don't see anything wrong with asking for a referral fee.
You know what I'm saying? It looks like you're in a
Yeah.
little bit of a bind of conflict.
I mean, at that point, it's this is not about the money.
No, but I'm saying it's part of it. Because
No,
you're saying
it's
there's only
not.
one winner in dual
No,
agency.
but this is not about the money. This is about representation.
True.
Okay. And so designated agency means that they have an advocate on their side. If a buyer came to Ken, we'll use Ken and Josh as an example, trying to see if we get Josh animated again. If a buyer comes to Ken and Ken says, look, you don't have an agent. I would really prefer that, you know, I give you the ABCs of agency. You absolutely have the option of getting an agent. And they say, well, we don't know anybody, or we don't, you know, we don't know who we should use. Ken can say, you know, look, I have a great office. I have great agents. I'd be happy to refer you to an agent in the office, and have you work with them, and they'd represent you in the transaction. We wouldn't talk outside of the transaction. It's completely separate. It's called designated agency. As you can see, this is how it works, blah, 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 blah. And they go, okay, yeah, great. I don't see any issue with Josh having to pay Ken a little bit of a referral fee. Is Josh going to be upset that he doesn't get to keep the whole commission on his side because he got handed a client that's literally going under contract at that moment? Probably not. And what happens if the buyer that Ken just handed to Josh decides, you know what, I don't want to buy Ken's listing. I'm going to go buy some other listing.
Now it's got a new buyer.
Again, you'd ask for a referral fee, right?
Right.
So I think in those modes, I think that's part of you gotta look at it from the big picture. Now,
Right.
referral fees are one of those things that I think you disclose.
Right. Wouldn't you need a form because the person would have to agree to be referred?
You again, yes, and that's, we're not in that section, so we're
No,
not
no.
going to go too deep into that.
Yeah.
But yes, when you do a referral, you want to do it the right way. We'll just say that. Does that make sense?
Well, I had an example where I had a listing in Chamblee and it was priced extremely low. The thing got like 30 offers immediately from every imaginable investor. And I brought a buyer. And when I can't remember who the broker was at the time, it wasn't you, but for $500, I flipped it. We gave another designated agent in the office. And part of that was because with the 30 plus offers that came in day one, we didn't want all these agents around the world to be like, you know, we didn't get a fair share at it, you know, because it's got an NA or the ML, whatever it says when it's not represented.
You as the listing agent, you have knowledge of those other offers, right? And so what you might share with that buyer might give an unfair advantage, which is why people get frustrated in those situations.
Right. So I think what we did for $500, someone in the office, we allow them to put their name as the customer.
Again, it's all about what somebody's willing to do. I'm not sure you could get away with $500 today, but you know, it's all about the conversation. All right, let's try to finish this section, which is just this. All right, so brokerage, less specified herein, real estate commissions to the seller's broker and buyer's broker, if any, are being paid pursuant to separate brokerage engagement agreements. Important, right? You need to have your own listing agreement, your own buyer brokerage agreement. Buyer and seller agree that any commissions to be paid to brokers shall be shown on the settlement statement and collected by closing attorney as precondition to the buyer and seller closing of the property, so long as the same is permitted by the buyer's mortgage lender, if any. Closing attorney is hereby authorized to direct to pay the brokers at closing their respective commissions pursuant to the written instructions from the brokers at closing. Their respected commission, I just read that line. Commission, the party owing the commission shall pay any shortfall at closing. Acceptance by the brokers of the partial real estate commission, if at the closing, shall not relieve the party owing the same from paying the remainder after the closing, unless the brokers have expressly agreed in writing, blah, blah. Brokers herein are signing the agreement to reflect their role in the transaction and consent to act as holder if either is named of them as the such holder of the earnest money in that case, right? And the agreement and any amendment thereto shall not be enforceable even without the signatures of any broker referenced herein. This is kind of an interesting paragraph because they slide in there. Why do brokers sign the purchase and sale agreement? Because we don't sign anything else, really. We don't have to sign anything else because it's really, we're not a party of the transaction, except for the fact that we're a party of the transaction as it relates to commission. And that's what this paragraph talks about. The disclaimer, I mean, remember I said this contract is written to protect us as brokers and agents. I mean, it leads right off with buyer and seller not relied upon any advice or representations of brokers other than what is included in this agreement. Okay, like you haven't had any other conversation outside? All right, whatever. But it really, and it goes through, even if you haven't given someone the pamphlets, which I always think you should give the pamphlets, and we'll talk in detail about those when we get to them. This paragraph, if you make your buyers read this paragraph, it will remind them of all the things they need to be paying attention to, because it lists out all of the things like surveys, appraisals, title searches, wood infestation reports, utility bill reviews, septic system inspections, well water tests for radons, asbestos, mold, methamphetamine, lead-based paint, moisture test of stucco or synthetic stucco, inspection of the property by a professional, blah, and on and on and on and on and on and on, right? So I think that it's very important if you're going to make a buyer and or seller read any part of the contract, I would absolutely make them read this paragraph. I might go so far as to make them initial next to it. What does that do for you? Remember, risk and reward? That pulls a whole lot of risk off of you as an agent, because you have now pointed that not only did you, I mean, if they sign the contract, they're supposed to, by law, you're supposed to read what you sign, right? Like if you don't understand it, you shouldn't sign it. But by putting a little initials next to this for the buyers to initial, it's awfully functional from the standpoint of they can't come back and say, hey, I didn't understand the zoning of the property was something I was supposed to look at. Yep, says right here, zoning of the property. You initial next to it. I don't understand the question, right? Again, professional support goes a long way in helping your clients understand which things to look at and all those sorts of things. But at the same time, this is a great kind of dump of information that might trigger a thought process, right? So from that standpoint, I think it's very important. This particular paragraph is extremely important in helping make sure that a buyer has been told what they're supposed to be paying attention to in the transaction.
Well, doesn't it sort of undermine our value when it says, don't rely on anything I've said, but pay me a fee?
Again, it's a CYA, so of course it's
Exactly.
undermining you. Yes. But at the same time, it theoretically just says anything that's not included in the agreement. So you've given them advice and counsel that has gotten them to agree or put into this contract what they've agreed to put in, right? And so that's the part that where your advice and counsel comes in. And so any of the things that come into this, whether it's about mold and tests for radons and well water test, like those are things that you are helping kind of plan, helping kind of think about. So I would highly recommend that you focus on this paragraph. We are out of time today. I don't want these to be too long because we get glossy-eyed and stop paying attention and have other things to do. But we will pick up next time. We will pick up with the time limit of the offer and all the cool little stuff at the bottom of the first page that people ignore and don't pay attention to. Just like we started at the beginning with the date, the offer date, and went into great detail about the offer date. We will go into great detail about the time limit and all the stuff that goes with that. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate that. And we will see you next week. We will pick right up with paragraph 11 and then start moving into the other sections of the contract, right? The non-fillable sections. And then of course the attachments, exhibits, all that kind of stuff. So thank you for coming and have a wonderful day.